Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Bahrain Historical and Archaeological Society. This is the second lecture going to be in English during our program and activities for this year and next year. I have chosen the topic of the history of East India Company because there is very little known about it for many reasons. One, when it was established, in fact, it is an enterprise of merchants of London. And merchants in general, they are not historians. They don't write history. They don't leave historical documents. What they leave is logbooks and export, import accounts, some calculations, and so on. Meanwhile, some of the also captains, the ship captains, they left for us some atmospheric record, areas they visited, and so on. But in general, it doesn't make a material for a historical review or a historical analysis of what happened exactly during the early years of the establishment of East India Company. And that's what I found when I took this title and started my research into the material available. I went to London really last September, went to the British Museum, British Library, looked around, and the only thing I could find is some logbooks, original from 17th century. They were 3 volumes and they wanted £700 for them. And the material inside doesn't make a material for a lecture. However, I managed through the library, the museum, and a few old bookshops in London to collect material. I visited also some of the offices, the original offices and the locations of this company, which I could live in the atmosphere before I write my material. So what I got is in the 1600, Queen Elizabeth chartered the Company of Governors and Company Merchants of London trading in the East Indies. A charter was given to these merchants to start trading in the East Indies and not in India, though it is called the East India Company. In 1709, this company merged with another company trading to the east to form the United Company of Merchants of England, trading again to the East Indies. Legally, this remained the official company name until 1879, but the Charter Act of 1833 referred to the company as the East India Company. This term was used in acts of parliaments, documents, and contracts. The East India Company was also called the Honorable Company, John Company. This name possibly derived from Jihan or Shah Jihan, because there is nobody called John in the original names of people who established this company. Or simply it was called the company. The India Act of 1858 saw the end of the company as an active entity, but the winding up process was not finally accomplished until 1874, when its last charter expired. The term servants of the company in connection with the company means anyone who is employed by the company, being a governor general or the lowest rank clerk. They call them the servants of the company. So the first voyage, after getting the charter of the company, set out in February 1601 under Captain James Lancaster. His flagship was the Dragon. The other vessels, the Hector, the Susan, and the Ascension. The fleet carried 28,472 of bullions for purchases and goods worth further 6,860 pounds, including wrought iron, crockery, pistols, spectacles, to the east. Lancaster knew enough in his record about scurvy, so he took lemon juice on board, and he was given 2 spoons daily for his staff. But captains of the other ships took the decision not to adopt these precautions. In 1602, the fleet arrived to Aceh in Sumatra, not to India. The Sultan welcomed the English, but they found that the Dutch had seized the initiative, so the Dutch were there before. The Dutch East India Company had raised to start up a capital of 540,000 sterling, while the English company only 68,000. If you noticed, I mentioned that the first currency was taken was the bullion, 28,472. Why it was bullions? In those days, in the East Indies, it was either the gold from Mexico, brought by the Portuguese, or the money dealt by the Spanish crown, or the local peace trade. The English money was not recognized in those areas. So it was a problem that the last minute when the fleet was leaving, they wanted money, and the Queen had to give permission that from the reserve of the state, bullions to be taken. This issue became a difficult issue in later years because the state cannot keep supplying bullions. And it is supposed to be an importing and exporting company, not to take bullions out from Britain. So they were taking more than what they were bringing. Lancaster was thwarted by the legitimate trade. He reverted to piracy. The Dutch prevented Lancaster from commercial activities in the East Indies. So he started his own piracy at the region. And he managed to seize a large cargo of pepper and Indian cotton from the Portuguese ship. He started participating in local Indian Ocean trade in piece goods, cotton, printed textiles, and produce in South India. He was selling them in Java and Sumatra. Can I have my first slide, please? That's Queen Elizabeth the First. Queen Elizabeth I, 1533, 1603. She was known as Queen Bess. Queen of England and Ireland from 1558 till 1603. She was daughter of Henry VIII, King of England, and of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. She was the last of the Tudor rulers of England, and although her legitimacy was questioned and never settled because of Act of Parliament in 1536, invalidated the marriage of her parents and enabled Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. Both Parliament and Henry named as heirs to this throne his children Edward, later Edward VI, Mary, later Mary I, and Elizabeth, in that order. She was a beloved, very advanced queen of her time, and she was famous. And during her reign, Britain started to expand its enterprise outside the British Isles. Lancaster was unable to purchase peppers at Achi, but he was able to set up trading factory. A factory here, when the company says factory, it is a combination of a fort, small fort, with a small garrison and a warehouse. Can I have the backlights on, please, Vina? After hair-raising voyage back, Lancaster finally returned to England and to a knighthood. He was knighted. The main disappointment was the pepper that he brought back in high expectation of making a profit. Unfortunately, James I had also captured a ship full of pepper, and the market was full of it. So the price dropped, and the investors were given a sack of peppers instead of financial revenue or money. Pepper, at least, was the main, or to remain, one of the staples of East India Company spice trading right through the 19th century, and the factories in Bantam in Java, Jakarta, and later Bencoolen in Sumatra provided uninterrupted supplies. However, when the company started to trade in South India and Ceylon, where cassia trees, the source of cinnamon, were indigenous, it was finally to gain ready access to some of the spices and thus far proved so elusive. After the company's failure in the Spice Islands, it quickly began to think of ways making most of its charter. It was known that there was substantial existing commerce between Surat in Gujarat, which is western India, all along the coast of Arabian Sea to the Red Sea. The slides that you see here is Britannia offered the goods of the East from China, from India, and from the Far East. On 31st December, this painting was at the dome of the East India Company House in London. It does not exist anymore, but there is a painting of it, and this is a copy of that painting. On 31st of December 1606, the company court of directors, which was called committee in later stage, discussed the possibility of obtaining letters of introduction from James I, the king followed Queen Elizabeth I, to then the Turkish governor of Aden. The third voyage under William Keeling was ordered to call on the region. Second in command was William Hawkins, who was valued because he spoke Turkish. And Aden and Yemen at that time was under the Turkish Ottoman hegemony. Keeling left for Bantam while Hawkins for Surat and Hector, anchoring in a tidal creek downstream from the town. Hawkins quickly discovered the twin obstacles to trade. One is the the corruption of the Mughal officials in charge of the coastal part of India, the other, the Portuguese. Although Portugal was in theory at peace with England, the Portuguese scuttled any plans that the company might have had by capturing 2 of Hector's boats along with their crews and taking them off to Goa. The Portuguese at that time, of course, they were in Hormuz, in the Gulf. They were in Dio, Goa, Bombay, Cochin, Ceylon, Aden, Bahrain, Qatif, and Gambrun or Bandar Abbas, which is now Bandar Khomeini. The Hector departed to Bantam, leaving Hawkins and his loyal friend William Finch at Surat. Hawkins hired the bodyguard of Patan, and leaving Finch to look after their goods at Surat, headed off to Agra, capital of the Mughal. Now, it's very important that we should open sort of a window on the Mughal court at that time, because historians sometimes are biased. They say we brought civilization to this part of the world as well as we dealt in commerce. So we would like to see, was the Mughal court civilized or not civilized? Was civilization really brought by these waves of colonialism, which later became a dominant power in the region, Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, American, and so on? Here I would divert a little bit to the Mughal court at the time of the arrival of the British, and not the Portuguese because they were there, and not the Dutch because they were there before, and not the French. These are the areas that the British went to first. They did not go to India. They went to Borneo, to Makassar, Panda, Abuina. They didn't reach the Philippines until later stage. But the tiny island down here was called Coloran or Poloran. They were so happy that they occupied that island that King James was called King of Britain Island and Poloran. And it was totally dissolute island, nobody even living in it, but it was in the name of the king. It was invaded. In 1556, Akbar became emperor. His accession to power marked a turning point in the history of the Mughal dynasty. By abandoning the custom of sharing power, by affirming his independence from the Islamic principles of sovereignty, he put in place a political, military, religious system that he controlled. He was an autocrat. His open-mindedness and tolerance held the empire together for almost 1 century. Akbar was proclaimed Padishah, King of Kings, at the age of 13, too young to hold the reins of power by himself. The new ruler was assisted by Humayun's, his father's faithful companion in exile, Bayram Khan. Bayram Khan, by turns, soldier, tutor, and dispenser of justice, a Shiite Turkoman of a noblest descent. He was present on all fronts. His fame was established when the emperor blessed his marriage to his cousin Salima, daughter of Humayun's sister. But soon, Akbar felt his power was declining to the benefit of his prime minister. The latter was increasingly flaunting his Shiite sympathies, whereas the emperor defended the Sunni convictions of the Turkish ancestor. At the same time, Akbar was under the influence of his nurse, Maham Anaga, who despite her affection for the dynasty was seeking to glorify her own son, the ruler's foster brother. In 1561, after an abortive attempt at rebellion, Bayram Khan was sent on pilgrimage and he was assassinated in the way. Then Akbar undertook not only the consolidation of his empire frontiers, but also the expansion of his territory. One of his first ambitions was to subjugate those notorious Rajput provinces of Rajasthan. And on the 10th of October 1567, the great Mughal and his army encircled the fortress that was reputed to be impregnable. In 1568, women, children had their throat cuts and a great massacre of the population, and in order to subjugate the Rajputs once and for all, Akbar resorted to matrimonial diplomacy. He married several Rajput princesses. His original wife was Maryam Zamani, daughter of a Raja of Amber. She gave birth to the future emperor Jahangir, who was called Salim before becoming Jahangir. However, the Rajput princesses were allowed and were authorized to practice their cult in a little temple built for them inside the apartments of the court. After Rajasthan comes Gujarat and Bengal, Kashmir and Afghanistan. In 1599, the towns of Ahmednagar, Asir Gara had fallen. The imperial troops set off on the road to the Deccan. Feeling that the threat ended, the Muslim sultans of Bedar, Golconda and Bijapur sent mission to the great Mughal to propose peace. Taking advantage of his father's absence, Prince Salim, future Jahangir, had himself declared king at Allahabad. This prompted Akbar to establish a new era characterized by the desire to centralize everything in his own hand and around himself. He decided to share the responsibility of the empire's main areas of administration, finance, army, justice, religion, and the royal household among 4 different ministers. He divided the empire into provinces, which is called Suba, appointed a governor assisted by a diwan, a court, to each province, and a sadr to look after the religion. Having noticed the diversity of languages and culture caused discord, Akbar imposed Persian as the court official language. He abolished Islam as the state religion. The calendar of harvest and that of tax levies would correspond to India's seasons. He replaced the Muslim era of Hijrah with Ilahi era of Persian type, whose months bore Zoroastrian names. He also replaced the old rupee with a new square one, which was called Jalali silver rupee. Having just had an immense red sandstone fort, which was called Lal Qal'a, Lal is written in Hindi, built in his capital at Agra, the emperor undertook in 1571 the construction of a city on the site of a village called Fatehpur, where his grandfather Babur had once built a garden of victory. Fatehpur is located halfway between Agra and Ajmer. This is Akbar sharing his design and thoughts with the builders of Fatehpur. In 1569, with the birth of Prince Salim, which was called Jahangir, Akbar decided to leave Agra. He intended to break with the reigns of the predecessors whose seat of power were either Delhi or Agra. Agra Darwaza, which is door of Agra, was the main entrance, and all the buildings built of red sandstone. 1585, Akbar abandoned Fatehpur to Lahore. The city lost its population and became a ghost town, especially after the plague of 1619. Akbar introduced innovation and rituals of the court. He abolished the jizya and practiced a custom peculiar to Hindu ceremonial appearance at the window, which was called darshan, weighing of the prince, and public audience or durbar. If you read some of the colonial books, you will find Lord Curzon in his meeting or ceremonies, we called for a durbar. Or in his visit to Muscat, he said we held a durbar. which is an Anglo-Indian, with the afternoon Diwani Khas. Diwani Khas means the private audience, where the sovereign received dignitaries and artists. He introduced musicians to his court. They were divided to 7 groups. Each day had its own orchestra. He changed the costumes, designed his own, and 1,000 were made each year for him. He developed the imperial workshops with a central Kitab Khana, the house of book. He asked 2 masters, Abdul Samad and Mir Sayyid Ali from Iran, to control the imperial painting studio and introduce the local artist to the art of the miniatures. This is the production of Abdul Samad and Mir Sayyid Ali. Above all, Akbar was searching for the truth. In 1575, he constructed in his capital Fatehpur Sikri a religious house of worship that was intended for debates. This house was house of adoration or ibadat khana. He always declared himself to be a Muslim, but gradually he was turning away from various Muslim doctrines and drew closer to Sufism. The first great Mughal died on the 27th of October 1605, leaving an empire that was as glorious as the Safavid dynasty in Persia and the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. After Akbar's death, the Mughal Empire reached its peak. Although its frontiers were regularly pushed back, its wealth and splendor made it one of the most dazzling courts in the Oriental world. Akbar's successor, too confident in the stability of the structures of the state that he had set up in a place, did not always perceive the need for reforms, and their power declined. Jahangir, Prince Salim, enthronement took place at Agra. This is the Ibadat Khana with Akbar, with Jesuits and Muslim clerics of various doctrines discussing Christ and the Prophet Muhammad's issue. It's an open discussion. This is Prince Salim or Jahangir's enthronement in Agra. This has taken place in the presence of a mixed crowd that had come from India and all the Orient. The new sovereign wanted to be an impartial dispenser of justice from the very start of his reign. In order to make good any injustice that might be committed against one of his subjects, he decided to have a golden chain furnished with 60 bells strung up between Agra's Red Fort and the nearby Yamuna River. In history, this is not the first time a chain with bells being installed for people who had suffered injustice. The first time it is recorded in the history is in the time of King Khosrow in Persia, whereby anybody who has suffered injustice, he can pull one of those bells and he'll be called to the court to see the emperor to complain of his problem. Any victim could be shaking this chain attracts attention to his case. Jahangir was very strong and devoted himself to hunting, combat sports. Lion hunting was the emperor's privilege. In 1611, the emperor, as all emperors, fell madly in love with a Persian woman called Mehr al-Nisa. She was married to a dignitary. She had left Agra to follow her husband post in Bengal. After an unexplained death of her husband, she returned to the heart of the imperial court and married Jahangir. He promoted her to the rank of his first wife, and she asked to be called Nur Mahal, the light of the court, before becoming Nur Jahan, the light of the nation or the universe. Her father was a Persian adventurer, I'timad al-Dawla, who had become Jahangir's prime minister. Jahangir, however, weakened by illness and alcoholism, relied on the decisions of his wife, competence whose portrait decorated the reverse of the silver coinage minted by the emperor. Jahangir, unlike other Mughal dynasts, he did not have a new capital. He imposed Agra and Lahore as imperial cities. He moved the center to Kabul, Ajmer, or Mandu, and he constructed Jahangirabad, present-day Dhaka, in Bengal. He was a great connoisseur of Persian poetry. He was curious about nature. He loved to observe landscape, flowers, animals, and dissecting birds. This Jahangir with his prime minister, weighing the prince on his 16th birthday. Costumes of Jahangir. The silk came from China and was fashioned in the imperial workshop of Agra or Lahore. Cotton was product from India and the finest muslin, which enhanced the beauty of Jahangir's tunics. He was a man of a taste. And this is, as you know, the peacock throne, which was taken later by Nader Shah back to Iran. Now we go back to the East India Company. It was Jahangir that Hawkins impressed with his Turkish and his seemingly unlimited capacity for drink, because Jahangir loved alcohol himself. Hawkins became a favorite at the court, and Jahangir found him an Armenian wife and gave him a command of a troop of 400 cavalry, with the title of Khan and a huge salary. Still, Hawkins failed to extract firm trading concessions from Jahangir and died on the voyage home. In 1615, James I sent Sir Thomas Roe to the court of Jahangir on a mission to improve trade relation. Roe left 3 years later, having achieved no monopoly rights again. He sought but a general permission to the trade. Roe also advised the company's director that war and traffic are incompatible. What he meant, conflicts between the European powers and the East and Far East, is not productable. It is counterproduction. He was pointing to the confrontation between the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French. We jump from there to coffee and maha, or in macha, or in mocha. If you go to Austria and Germany, you will find coffee shops, they say mocha coffee. In fact, it is coffee from macha in Yemen. And as I said, because of the presence of the Dutch and the East Indies, and the Portuguese and the Indian shores and ports, the British had to look now further from those areas. They looked at the trades carried from Gujarat to the Arabian Sea, Arabian Peninsula, and the Red Sea. So they started directing their attention to the Arabian part. East India Company, like the English themselves, has an indelible association with tea. However, at the start of the 17th century, the company was more concerned with coffee. And by the end of the century, coffee was being consumed in England far more widely than tea. It was only after 1750 that the company and the country thoroughly immersed in tea. So what happened in Maha? In 1579, the company received intelligence about the potential commercial significance of coffee. As yet unknown to Europe, it was aware from the maps and information provided by Richard Hakluyt, the cartographer, that it would only be obtained from the Turkish port of Maha at the southern end of the Red Sea, in Arabia Felix. Ascension, which is the ship, has called at Maha with John Jardine aboard. After traveling through the mountains with their coffee plantations, he recorded his appraisal of the cultivation and drinking of coffee, and the observation that coffee is a great merchandise. He said, for it is carried to Grand Cairo, other places of Turkey, and the Indies. He obtained permission from the Pasha of Sana'a to trade from Maha. In the next voyage, the directors diverted their ships to Maha in command of Sir Henry Middleton. Middleton's arrival to Maha in October 1609 ended in confrontation between him and the Turkish official. He was taken captive, clapped in iron to Sana'a on a promise of not interfering in Makha's merchant affair. Why is that? You see, the British were prevented from trading in the East Indies. They were prevented trading in the Indian part. So they were waiting for the Gujarat fleet carrying the Indian commerce to the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea. There, and then they will buy the goods of India and they will sell it to the Turkish merchants at the Red seaports. And putting extra price and extra tax, that made the Turkish officials complain about this behavior and, of course, prompted the Pasha and Sana'a to arrest Middleton. From Surat, he returned to Makha to wreak his revenge. Now, he was released, he left the area, but he went to Surat, and from Surat he came back in his fleet, and he destroyed the Gujarat fleet, the Ottoman fleet, and the Arab fleet at the Yemeni ports, confiscated the goods of 15 Gujarati trading ships waiting to enter port. It was the negotiating skills of Sir Thomas Roe to re-establish good relations with Yemen. The company was soon engaged in the coffee trade with an agent in Makha in 1619. It is worth noting that early in the 18th century, the enterprising Dutch took coffee plants from Arabia to their possessions in the East Indies, establishing substantial coffee plantations there. Since coffee trade became one of the company's first activities. Now, what about tea? I would like to give you a few lines about tea trading by the East India Company, because everybody thought East India Company traded in tea, but they traded in everything, including tea. And if you know or you remember that the confrontation between the British and the American in Boston Bay was when the American threw the British tea out, the British East India tea, to the sea. And that's what started the whole conflict until America became independent. Tea was not the initial target of the company's trade with China, but it rapidly assumed enormous significance, and from the mid-18th century onward was by far and away the most important item of trade. Tea had been used in ancient China for many thousand years, also in Burma and Siam. At first for medicinal purposes, but later as beverage. In the 12th century, Japan learned about the cultivation and drinking of tea from China, while Russia was the first European nation to import tea on camel trains across the Gobi Desert. In 1793, Lord Macartney led a mission to Beijing and the Chinese Emperor's palace at Jehol. With him, Sir George Staunton, an eminent botanist, Staunton and Sir Joseph Banks, the founder of modern economic botany, who advised Staunton to observe carefully and record the Chinese methods of cultivating and scenting tea. Banks experimented with many different teas flavoring along the lines suggested by Staunton. The blend of bergamot oil and tea was the nearest thing to the Chinese bitter orange. This recipe was named after the Prime Minister of the time, Earl Grey. So you go to the coffee shops here, they say, would you like Earl Grey tea? One of aim of Macartney's mission to China had been to acquire some Chinese silkworms. The Chinese could not be persuaded to part with them. However, the mission did acquire specimens which were successfully bred in the botanical gardens in Calcutta, that hotbed of economic botany which had been set up by the East India Company at the initiative of Sir Joseph Banks. Now, so far the company is dealing with coffee, tea, and silk. In January 1618, I'm going to take you back to the confrontation between the British and the Dutch. In January 1618, an English prisoner in Bantam, Jakarta, he wrote it exactly this way because this is an Old English. They kept 12 of us in a dungeon where they pissed and shatty upon our heads. In this manner we lay until we were broken out from top to toe like lepers, having nothing to eat but dirty rice and stinking rainy water. They were arrested by the Dutch. They were put at the hole in the ground with grill, Every morning, the Dutch will come and sit there and empty their bowl and empty their bladder on top of the British down in that hole. John Jordan of Mocha was killed by the Dutch marksmen of the Malay Peninsula. He was the commander of the English fleet to the Spice Islands. The Dutch East India Company, though it tolerated the company's presence on its fringes, had no intention of giving any ground in the Spice Islands. The Dutch had already seized the Portuguese fort of Amboinas, Tirante. The company, in fact, was spice running more than trading because of the Dutch presence in the area. The relation between the Dutch and the English in the Spice Island was that of constant harassment and attrition. From 1616 till 1680, the company had by ruthless force prized from the Spice Islands and soon lost its toehold in Batavia, which was Jakarta, leaving only factories at Makassar and Bantam. The small island of Poloron was used as a pawn in peace negotiations between the Dutch and the English and was eventually handed back to the crown in 1665. Poloron was eventually ceded to the Dutch under the Treaty of Breda in 1667, and Poloron, that small tiny island that I mentioned earlier, was eventually ceded to the Dutch under the Treaty of Breda and retained for a small island of the American seaboard called New Amsterdam. The Dutch thought they had got the better of the deal at the time, but the inhabitant of a present-day Manhattan might disagree. That small island given to the British became Manhattan. Again, this is Akbar. He was given a choice to meet King James, the Ottoman emperor or sultan, or a Sufi sheikh. He preferred the Sufi man. This is in his later time. That's Akbar. This is a coffee drinking at the Mughal court. Most probably these are Portuguese dignitaries. East India Company in Japan. Although the East India Company had been set up primarily as an importing company in contrast to exported activities of the Levant, which is the second company in Britain, and two other chartered trading companies of the time, the Muscovy and the Eastlanders. The directors were mindful that constant draining of bullions, which I mentioned earlier, reserve resulting from their trade was politically unpopular. They would have liked to sell English woolen broadcloth to a third party in exchange for bullions and then sit and use the bullions to buy the spices, which were the main target of their early trade. John Sares, who was 32 years old, factor at the company's factory at Bantam in Java, submitted a report to the directors in 1608, in which he suggested that Japan represented a fine commercial opportunity. His view was confirmed shortly afterward in letters from William Adam. If some of you saw the series Shogun, Adam was shown in that series. An Englishman who had been acting as a pilot for Dutch fleet and had settled in Japan from 1600. There he had built a remarkable career for himself as a principal marine architect to the Shogun, had taken a Japanese wife, and was prepared to assist his countrymen in establishing trade with Japan. This is called Linhoten's map. Linhoten was a Dutch who worked with the Portuguese in Goa. He sent home a lot of records of the size and the value of commerce carried by the Portuguese in the region, and that what established or was the initiative of establishing the Dutch East India Company. His name was Hugh van Linhoten. You see the size of the Dutch fleet returning home. This is a letter in relation to Japan, a letter which the writer says, please send me the best chow or chai. he says, this is a letter from Wickham mentioning a pot of the best sort of chow or tea, in a date earlier than what is written historically when the British started consuming tea. This is much earlier date, which I'll mention later. However, Saris was commissioned to take the ship from 8th voyage, which was called the Clove. The ships were called either in a man name, a country name, or a herb name, or a flower name, or an animal name, and proceeded from Bantam to Japan with the aim of establishing a factory. In 1613, he arrived to Hiredo. Adam accompanied Saris to Yedo, today's Tokyo. Saris left in the same year, 1613, in the Clove, leaving Adams and Mr. Cooks in charge of the English factory in Hiredo. 2 years later, 1615, that the use of the word for tea was first recorded in English. An English factor, which is Mr. Wickham, writing to his friend Mr. Eaton in Hiredo, asked to buy a pot of best chow in Miyako, the place where tea was grown for the shogun. It seems that tea drinking was well established among the English some 50 years before Catherine of Borganza married Charles II, and Catherine introduced the tea into the British court. Mr. Saris, going back to England, he took some pornography books from Japan with him in those days. And that, of course, was a very embarrassing situation for the company. They called the board of directors. He was punished by being dismissed from the company's work. And the books were burned in the chimney of the House of India in London in front of all board of directors and the big investors. I wonder today what would happen if he takes pornography books back. The East India Company in China. China had been known as a source of various exotic, luxurious goods since ancient times, and the East India Company was keen to start trading there. The company first ship to visit was called the London in 1637. It was followed by Commander John Whittle's attempts on behalf of the rival Courtine Association. Courtine Association is a company formed by the British court to compete with the merchants of London, to open up commercial contacts. In 1637, neither visit was a great success. The Manchu emperor eventually opened his ports to foreign trade in 1685, and the company's first trading post was at Amoy. Although with the rapid rise of tea trade in the late 17th century, Canton became a better place to service their requirement. This is the seafront of Canton, waterfront, with all the agencies and the companies' headquarters are there. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Opium War because this is a different political issue which the company got involved in, and that involved the government, let's say, of China and the traders of the East India Company smuggling opium from India to China in order to get money for trading purposes. And it has its own chapters in the history of the company. Let's come back now to the Gulf. At the time, the English and Dutch were partaking in a deadly rivalry in the eastern islands. The historic fight against the Portuguese was proceeding practically without interruption. Though heavily beaten with some of her best centers of trade captured, her commerce crippled and her prestige shattered, Portugal fought on with all the energy of despair. Driven out of the eastern seas by the Dutch ships, she concentrated her resources on the defenses of her positions in India, especially Goa. Goa was no mean city. It was only one of several important positions that Portugal then owned in the region, like Cochin, Cananor, Colombo, Ceylon, Jaffna-Patam, Hormuz, Gambrun, Bahrain, and Qatif. At the very early stage following their first visit to Surat, the English turned their attention to the Gulf trade. They looked at the Gulf as a channel for the prosecution of Eastern trade. East India Company earliest venture was probably Sir Robert Shirley. That's the East India Company protecting its commerce against Arabs, Chinese, and Indians. This is looking from the Indian side towards the Arabian side, towards Jask, Bandar Abbas, Gambrun, Hormuz, Bushehr, Muscat, and these areas. So the British were somewhere here in Surat, later in Bombay, and they were looking at this route now. They forgot that Far East route. This is Robert Shirley, a gentleman adventurer in his Persian clothes, who for a good many years at the opening of the 17th century figured on the diplomatic stage in Europe as ambassador to Shah Abbas the Great, or Shah Abbas I. Robert Shirley was a resourceful man and soon won his way to favor by measures he introduced for the reorganization of the Persian army on European lines. In 1607, he had practically adopted a Persian domicile by marrying the daughter of Armenian noble, who was one of the Shah's principal officers. That's his wife. In 1608, Robert Shirley was employed by the Shah on a diplomatic mission to the court of King James. In 1615, he was back in Persia, but was sent by Shah Abbas for a fresh mission in Europe, Portugal, Spain, and later England. He represented the Shah in Europe for 13 years, but on returning to Persia was told that the Shah had no further use for his services because the Shah already contacted the East India Company in the region. He was intensely mortified, sickened, and he died. His remains were in the first instance buried under his doorstep in Tehran, but were later exhumed by his wife, taken to Rome, and buried in the church of Santa Maria della Scala. His wife entered the convent attached to the church on quitting the East. She became a nun. In the second visit of Shirley to the British court, there was a Persian ambassador already there. And there was a big conflict between the two ambassadors. The Persian claims he is the ambassador, Shirley says he is the ambassador. So the King James accepted that they are both ambassadors. However, the Persian ambassador died, and that was considered the first Muslim grave of a dignitary in London. I had a drawing of it, I don't have a slide, with Muslim calligraphy written on it. So perhaps some of the people who were with him, they made the calligraphy on the grave. When Richard Steele and a companion John Crowther were at the route to Europe through Persia from India in 1615, Shirley procured a cordial reception for him from Shah Abbas, who readily granted a firman for trading purposes. It was not, however, until 1617 when the East India Company sent out Edward Cannock as a factor to develop the Persian trade that any practical steps were taken to turn an account of favorable positions which Shah thought the influence of Shirley had formed for the English. Shah Abbas granted the English Jask or Jask head full freedom of trade and contracted to deliver to them 1,000 to 3,000 bales of silk annually at a price of 6 shillings to 6 shillings and 6 pence per pound. At the close of 1621, 5 ships from the English fleet arrived in the Gulf under the joint command of Captain Blythe and Niddle. At the time, the Persian has besieged Hormuz. An agreement was signed between the English and Allaverdi Khan, the Persian commander. From there, the end of the Portuguese domination of the Gulf was imminent. What happened to Shah Abbas? His main trade was silk. But Shah Abbas had no fleet, and he was under the mercy of the Portuguese in Hormuz, who were buying at their set price, not at his. Up north, they were the Turkish Empire and the Ottoman. They were enemies of Shah Abbas, so he cannot export through the land route. The sea route is blocked by the Portuguese, and the only way out was to ally himself with the British, to give them facilities on the Persian coast, and to make a joint venture against the Portuguese presence in the Gulf, and that's how Hormuz was destroyed by the British fleet from the sea, the Persian army from the land. Before doing that, in February 1622, which was the destruction of Hormuz, Shah Abbas conquered Bahrain in 1612, and that was a negotiating paper in his hand with the Portuguese. He said, leave Hormuz, you get Bahrain. You don't leave Hormuz, you don't get Bahrain. Why Bahrain was important for the Portuguese? It was the pearls. They were carrying the Bahraini pearls to all Europe. And there was a letter at that time from King of Spain, who was the joint ruler of Portugal and Spain, saying to the Portuguese officer at the fort in Hormuz, get Bahrain by any means, bribes, army, destruction, whatever, but don't leave it in the hand of the Persian. However, Bahrain was lost. I go back to Madras. Madras was ceded by a treaty in 1639, and it was the first permanent toehold that the company gained on the subcontinent. It had a few natural advantages apart from its location, reasonably healthy climate, and its relation with the Bay of Bengal. Although it was a vital sea link with England, it was a presidency looking for a port, for its landing facilities were rudimentary to non-existent. Madras was the company's first fortified settlement in India. The construction of Fort St. George began in 1640 and continued on and off for 150 years. It housed all the administrative and military necessities. At first, the Indian quarter was called the Black Town. Eventually, as the city expanded, Black Town became a desirable location for white businesses. From Madras, the company made its significant move to become a territorial power. The French East India Company down the coast at Pondicherry was initially purely a trading rival, but under the leadership of the Governor Dupleix. It had started to forge a strategic alliance with local potentates in an attempt to gain control of the Carnatic coast and outset the English. However, Muhammad Ali Walijah, a claimant to the throne of Arcot, ruler of Carnatic province, allied himself with the company against the French and their client, the Nizam of Hyderabad. Muhammad Ali seized Trichinopoli, a key fortress in the south, where he was besieged by the French and their allies. Robert Clive, that's Robert Clive, then a young and ambitious writer. Writer means a clerk. His salary was £5 a year, per year. In the Madras service, had requested to move to a military. He wanted to become a military man. And with Major Stranger Lawrence together had successfully defeated the French forces at Arcot and ended their ambitions in the Carnatic. Madras lost its preeminent status to Calcutta after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Bombay. Charles II had acquired Bombay along with the habit of drinking tea by marrying Catherine of Braganza. That's Robert Clive in Calcutta, which I'll come back to it later. Warren Hastings. I'll bring this slide back to you later. That's Catherine of Braganza. Catherine of Braganza was from Portugal. She was a Portuguese bride for Charles II of England. When she went to marry Charles, her dowry to Charles was Bombay. It was given to the British. Of the three presidencies, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, Bombay had the best harbor, and Bombahaya, it means the beautiful port. I think, is it Binu? It is the beautiful bay, or Bombahaya by the Portuguese. Bombay was wholly under the company's control because this belonged to the King of England. This led to the most of the English decamping from Surat. They were soon joined by a wealthy Gujaratis and Parsis merchants communities. Nonetheless, Bombay remained the least important of the three presidencies, and its boom came at the end of the 19th century after the company had left. If you carry on studying the British history in the region, you will find that the correspondence of the Gulf resident in Bushehr with Bombay company, with Bombay government, while the correspondence of Bombay government is with all India government in Calcutta. So Bombay looked after the Gulf, while Calcutta looked after the whole region, including India, of course, and the Far East. Calcutta. Job Charnock, the company's most experienced factor in Bengal in 1690, founded Calcutta. Bengal having become increasingly important to the company's trade, several factories had been established there since 1640, including one at the Hooghly, just north of Calcutta. In his war with the Mughal, Charnock evacuated Hooghly and set up camp near the village of Kalighat. Kalighat is what became later Calcutta. At this location, Calcutta was established, and the work began on Fort William in 1697. It was to become the largest and the most impregnable of the company's building in India. This is the presidency and the Bombay governor's house. The company in the East. The East India Company evolved in time in two quite different creatures. On one hand, there was the company in India where territorial tax revenue and political interest had developed, although trade alone had initially been envisaged. On the other hand, there was the company in East where territorial acquisition was kept to a minimum and trade assumes the priority. The company that ruled in India was dependent on its army. The company that traded further east depended on the sea and the fleet. The might of the company and the British Navy came to be deployed in keeping the sea lanes open for trade against actual potential enemies. Singapore, or Sanhapura. Unlike Hong Kong, Singapore was a creation of the East India Company, which needed a secure base at the head of strategically vital straits of Malacca. The Dutch were trying to exclude the British ships from the straits. Stamford Raffles. This is a house in Britain on the style of the Indian design or architect. And this is the garden with the oxen and the male organ, which was also from the mythology of India. Singapore or Sanhapura. Stamford Raffles, who was also a company clerk to start with, and then became Governor General of Java and the founder of the Singapore. He ended up broke and desperate and died very poor. Now, let me go back to the slides of Calcutta and explain to you what was happening there. Siraj al-Dawla, the agent of the Mughal court in Calcutta, did not like the British presence in Calcutta. And a war of interest, a conflict of interest started in Calcutta between the British and Siraj al-Dawla. Clive and the East India Company allied themselves with Mir Ja'far and defeated Siraj al-Dawla, and Calcutta was ceded to the British. Clive, from a salary of £5 a year, got 250,000 sterling as a gift for that, beside a few villages where the income will be fixed all his life to him, and the treasury of Siraj al-Dawla was ransacked by Clive and his companions. Clive committed suicide. He became a drug addict and he committed suicide, and there is a nice book, one of the books I read for this lecture is called The Emperor. It was Clive. Warren Hastings was the first Governor General of Calcutta when Calcutta became the main presidency of the British presence in India. The second enemy for the British was Tipu Sultan of Mysore. Tipu Sultan was very advanced, progressive thinking ruler who wanted also the British out from all India. He fought with the British, they defeated him, and when he was defeated, they took his children as a hostage to make sure that he will behave well with the British. In the second battle, Tipu Sultan was murdered by the British. The general who has taken the children of Tipu Sultan was himself defeated by the Americans and kicked out from America. And this is handing over the children of Tipu Sultan. On 12th April 1763, the East India Company concluded an agreement with the Sheikh of Bushehr. His name was Nasser al-Madhkur, father of Nasser al-Madhkur, who was in control of Bahrain at that time. 3 months later, this was confirmed by Karim Khan Zand, or Wakil al-Dawla, or Wakil al-Ummah, he was called, the emperor of Persia. After 60 years, in 1769, Bushehr was abandoned because of deterioration of the trade, but was re-established in 1775. In 1778, the company court of directors ordered that staff of Basra should be withdrawn and sent to Bushehr. Until 1778, the resident at Bushehr was immediately responsible to the agent and consul at Basra. In 1947, now I'm going to jump, because now no more company exists. It's finished, as I said, in 1800, where the parliament produced an act that a company cannot control a country like India, cannot run an army, cannot call the British Navy to help and invade the countries, so it has to become a sort of establishment belonging to Britain or the British Empire. And then politics took over commerce. In 1947, the residency was moved to Bahrain, which is Al-Ayyam. The first resident was called Benjamin Jarvis, and that was in Bushehr in 1700. The last in Bahrain was called William Rupert Hay, which was until 1953. The first agent in Bahrain, John Callicott Gaskin, 1900-1904. The first agent in Kuwait was Stewart George Knox. I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, that you agree with me that the amount of written material available to the researcher of the East India Company is massive, and it is of variable topics and themes. From day one, the company documented its progress, failures, adventures, and success. Its eminent personnel, from botanists, cartographers, artists, factors, and fleet commanders, gave us enough material which we can carefully use in writing our own contemporary history. In fact, not only our history, but all the countries around us. Thank you very much. In fact, Shirley was a brother of another Robert Shirley. There were 2 Shirleys. And on Shirley's next return from England, he brought the first British ambassador to the Shah Abbas court. They landed by mistake at Balochistan, and the ambassador brought his British wife with him. The ambassador died immediately from the heat. The wife delivered, and she died, and the baby died 3 days later. That's how the atmosphere was, and it was totally different than what you see. And still they took the challenge and they came to the area. This is the house of the governor of Singapore. This was found in one of the convents in Britain. It's an original bed which came, I think, from China by the East India Company in their first or second voyage. It was a complete bed with its upholstery, and was reassembled again in a museum there in Britain. This is how the British took the style of the Indian clothes, silk. Not only that, but they also had 2 wives. He's an agent with 2 wives from India itself. This is just a factor's house, one of the let's say senior clerk house in India. He had so many servants and so many helpers. This is the establishment of the Madras port. The Dutch fleet. Not Nasr al-Din Shah. This is anyway. It is the Qajar king or emperor meeting the British dignitaries at his court in Persia. I will remember his name later. Warren Hastings, and that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Brian. Tafadhal.
Would you agree that right from the outset, although the intention was commerce, but in reality it was used as a strategy for fulfilling a much wider, much bigger objective? And then when it was phased out, because maybe at that stage it was easier to move forward and dominate these places, but the objective was a much bigger one, the political one, and of course the ruler, the dominate all the different countries. And then when it was phased out, possibly that strategy was no longer working.
Let me explain exactly some political issue. In the 15th century, the Mediterranean Sea became sort of an Ottoman lake. The Ottoman expanded in North Africa, in Damascus, Egypt, and it was totally closed area for the commerce from Europe. So the only way to get the commerce, the goods of the East and the Far East to Europe was to go around Africa and the Cape of Good Hope, then down to the East Africa and up to the Indian. And the state which started on behalf of the Christian world to do this was Portugal. That small tiny nation, it started this commercial enterprise because of a given political situation at that time, because of the Muslim invasion of Europe and closing the trade route through the Suez and Red Sea and the land which comes across Iraq, Syria, and then to the Mediterranean, with the Phoenicians and the people from Italy, Genoa, and these places. The Portuguese fleet kept documents, and those documents shows how much they were getting from the East and the Far East, and how much interest they were getting when they sell this to Europe. The inflation of the price was 200 to 300 times for a good that you get in the Far East and you sell in Europe. That much the money they were getting, and that's what made them to take the challenge. Each ship which went to the East had 150 people, it comes back with 30 or 40. The remaining will die. Scurvy, fever, battles, drowning, everything. During the Drake's sea war between Spanish court and the British court, the British found in the Spanish ships, the wrecked Spanish ships or the Armada, documents with Lenhoten's map, which shows the routes, the amount of trade, quality of trade available in the East. From there on, the British merchants of London, and not the government of Britain, made a decision that they must get independent from trading through agent, that's Portugal and Spain, because they were enemies, and go themselves for this. And that's how it started. In fact, first they went north. They were looking to a shorter route by going north. They failed. Then they started their eastern trade through going through the east. 100 years after the Portuguese and the Dutch. This is from one point. All documents available about the East India Company for almost 200 years does not show any political ambition. It also does not show any political interest or land acquirement. The only time which has changed from being commercial enterprise to a political military enterprise when the conflict with the French started in Madras. When they started the conflict and Napoleon was threatening to take the East and advance by allying himself with Russia through the Persia and then Afghanistan and then to India, where the Indian subcontinent will be lost to the French, this is when the British started thinking politics. And this is when Clive from a clerk became a general and Warren Hastings became a governor, and they started collecting revenues on behalf of the Mughal court in Indian lands and started cultivating the land, playing games with the Rajas and the Maharajas and the local rulers, removing one, defeating the other, allying with themselves with this and removing that, and they entered into the Indian subcontinent because of the challenge of the French. While if you look at this part of the world, they never took any land. They were always at the ports. The only time which they landed is 1820 And this was almost at the last years of the company when they sent a fleet, joint fleet from India and Britain to destroy the forts of the Arabs of the United Arab Emirates, which they called at that time the Pirate Coast. And they enforced an agreement of 1820 on the Arab rulers of the Gulf, which was called the Maritime Agreement. And in that agreement, all the articles is related to commerce, and it has nothing to do with political domination. Of course, the colonial thinking developed, and the imperial adventures became sort of a competition between France from one side, Germany from the other side, and Britain. Belgium entered into it, and everybody, and there was what was called crawling and marching to Africa and to the east. Here, the whole picture has changed. Here, Britain had to decide that no more commerce, but politics. Okay, and politics became a priority in front of the commerce. However, they guaranteed the commerce because by the end of the war, the First World War, the Gulf, India, it was part of England. It was not an independent area. It was totally under the control of the British. There was nobody else to compete with them. Because as you know, Russia changed into Bolshevik system, and Bolsheviks at that time, however, they didn't have sort of an invasive or invasion policy. In fact, they pulled back from northern Iran. They went back to Russia, and they stopped allying themselves with the British. The Dutch were already kicked out by Mir Mhanna from the Gulf. There were no more Dutch. The French had no interest at all in the region, apart of Beit Faransa and Oman. So Britain and Germany was destroyed. Germany was destroyed completely. They have no, their ambition of building a railway from Istanbul through Kuwait to the Gulf was also completely destroyed with the war. So Britain became the main power in the whole region. This is when, what you call it, the third imperial wave came to the region. The first was, of course, the commercial. The second was invading India. The third was after the First World War. They were waves of invasion, but in different color, in different style, in different attitude, by different people, but you can study it all together as the history of imperialism. You translate it as you like.
So, Dr. Isa, how long was exactly the resistance in the area?
The British, how long?
No, the companies.
The company, as I said, from the 1600, okay, until 1833, 35. It was around 250 years. Around 250 years. There was a branch here near Delmon Hotel. Yeah. It's called East India Company.
So they still exist.
Yeah. No.
A very tiny question. The slide you showed us that on the shore,
yeah,
there's a building, it's a government house.
Yes.
Is it the present one? Is it just called Bombay Gate, or is it the same?
Maybe there are so many monuments and buildings which were built by the British still exist. The post office, the railway station, the Calcutta House, the presidency, 1650.
Maybe you were talking about the Gate of India, which it is.
This is the same one?
The governor's house is now where the naval fort is.
Well, it was the same, it's on the shore also. Well, it was the same.
Anyway, Bombay was an island also, if you want to know. It was reclaimed, and it became sort of part of the land. And the first people they brought to live in Bombay were prisoners, to make a colony out of it. And in fact, they didn't like it, they ran away. But a good governor, he changed the whole system and brought all the merchants and became the most important part.
We must thank you very much.
Ahlan wa sahlan. Thank you.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank you.